In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt drove out to a barren hill in southeastern Turkey that everyone else had already given up on. 30 years earlier, a survey team from the University of Chicago had walked across that same hill, kicked at the broken limestone sticking out of the dirt, decided it was the rubble of an abandoned medieval cemetery, and left. Nobody went back. The hill was just a low mound of dust and broken rock that local farmers had been plowing around for generations, snagging their blades on stones they assumed were old grave markers. Schmidt walked the surface for a few minutes, then he stopped. He later said he understood in that moment that he had two choices: turn around and leave, or spend the rest of his life right there. Because the broken stones poking out of the dirt weren't gravestones. They were the tops of something enormous. Something that had been deliberately, carefully, completely buried under thousands of tons of earth by human hands. And when his team finally began cutting down into that fill, when they finally opened the walls that someone had packed in on purpose to seal this place shut, what they pulled out of the ground didn't just rewrite a chapter of the human story, it detonated the timeline. Because the structure under that hill was a temple, a massive ring of carved stone monuments, taller than a person, weighing as much as a loaded truck, covered in carvings of vultures and scorpions and snakes and headless men. And when the limestone was dated, the number that came back was so old that it broke the model every textbook on Earth had been printed with. This temple was built around 9600 BC. That's more than 11,000 years ago. It is 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. It is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It was already ancient, already buried, before the first human being anywhere on the planet planted a seed of wheat, fired a pot of clay, forged a piece of metal, wrote a single word, or invented the wheel. People who could not yet farm, people who had no cities, no writing, no agriculture, no pottery, no metal tools, no domesticated animals. People we have always been told were simple wandering hunter-gatherers, built, and then, for reasons no one has fully explained, they buried it. This is the story of what's actually inside Gobekli Tepe. And by the end of it, you'll understand why the man who excavated it said a single sentence that reversed the entire accepted order of human history. Why he believed that everything we were taught about how civilization began happened in exactly the wrong order. You'll see the carved human skulls, drilled and grooved, to be hung and displayed. You'll see the 16-ton pillars that should have been impossible to move. You'll see the carved stone that some researchers believe is a memorial to the day the sky fell. And you'll learn the detail that the excavators themselves admit is almost too much to think about. That after 30 years of digging, more than 90% of this place is still in the ground. Still sealed, still waiting. Let's start with the date, because nothing else makes sense until you understand the date. To understand why Gobekli Tepe broke archaeology, you have to understand the order in which we always believed things happened. For more than a century, the story of civilization was taught as a straight line, and the line had a fixed beginning. First, the theory went, humans learned to farm. Around 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, wandering bands of hunter-gatherers figured out how to plant and harvest grain. Farming produced a food surplus. The surplus meant people could stop wandering and settle in one place. Settlement produced villages. Villages grew into towns. Towns produced specialists, potters, builders, priests, people who didn't have to spend every waking hour finding food. And only then, only after all of that, once humans had spare time and spare resources in a settled society, could they finally afford to build something monumental. A temple, a monument. Religion on a grand scale was supposed to be the last thing to arrive. The luxury at the very top of the pyramid, only possible after everything underneath it had been built first, farming first, then cities, then, eventually, temples. Gobekli Tepe takes that entire sequence and turns it upside down. When Schmidt's team sent limestone and organic material from the oldest layers off for radiocarbon dating, the results placed the construction of the first great enclosures at around 9600 BC, and possibly earlier, is roughly 11,600 years ago. And here is the part that stopped the field cold. At that date, in that region, agriculture did not yet exist. Wheat had not been domesticated. There were no farms, no fields, no villages of mud brick houses, no pottery, no metal, no surplus. The people living in that landscape were hunter-gatherers. They ate wild game, gazelle and aurochs and wild boar, and they gathered wild plants. They were, by every assumption we had ever made, the least likely people on Earth to build something monumental. And they built the most monumental thing on Earth. Think about what that requires. To build Gobekli Tepe, you don't just need a few strong people. You need to quarry pillars weighing up to 10 and even 16 tons out of solid bedrock, using nothing but stone tools. Because metal hadn't been invented, you need to carve those pillars with detailed reliefs of animals. You need to move them hundreds of meters across rough ground. You need to stand them upright in precise arrangements. And you need to feed the workforce that does all of that for years. In a world with no agriculture, which means someone had to organize the hunting and gathering of enough wild food to sustain a team of laborers who weren't producing any food of their own. That is not the behavior of simple wandering bands. That is organization. That is engineering. That is a society with leadership, with planning, shared belief powerful enough to command labor on a massive scale. And it existed thousands of years before the first thing we thought made any of it possible. This is what led Klaus Schmidt to the conclusion that reversed the model. He looked at the evidence and proposed something radical, that we had the entire sequence backwards. It wasn't that farming created the surplus that eventually allowed temples. It was the opposite. It was the temple that came first. The need to gather, to build, to worship in one place, the gravitational pull of a sacred site, is what drew people together, kept them returning to the same spot, and eventually forced them to find a more reliable food supply to feed the crowds. In other words, the desire to build something holy may have been the very thing that drove human beings to invent agriculture in the first place. First came the temple, Schmidt said, then the city. Religion didn't arrive at the end of the human story as a luxury. It may have been the engine at the very beginning. And if that's true, if the urge to build Gobekli Tepe is what pushed our ancestors to settle down, farm, then this hill in Turkey isn't just an old building. It's the place where civilization itself was born, out of order, thousands of years too early, by people who weren't supposed to be capable of it. But the date is only the first impossibility, because the more pressing question isn't how old it is. It's why, after all that work, someone went to even greater lengths to bury it. Here's the part that the headlines never quite explain. When we say scientists opened the walls of Gobekli Tepe, we don't mean they walked into a standing building. We mean they dug it back out, because by the time anyone in the modern world set eyes on it, the entire complex was gone, completely entombed under an artificial hill of packed rubble, soil, flint chips, and broken animal bone. Reason a survey team in the 1960s mistook it for a medieval graveyard is that all they could see were the very tops of the tallest pillars poking through the surface. Everything else was underground, not collapsed, not eroded, not slowly swallowed by time, buried by hand on purpose. This is one of the strangest facts about the entire site, and it's easy to skim past, so sit with it for a second. People who built Gobekli Tepe, who quarried these pillars, carved them, raised them, apparently used them for centuries, at some point deliberately filled their own temple to the brim with debris until it vanished. Fill isn't natural sediment that drifted in over the millennia. The excavators found it packed densely with material that had to be carried in and dumped. Limestone fragments, flint tools, and the flakes left over from making them, and enormous quantities of broken animal bones from feasting. They essentially packed the enclosure solid, sealing the great stone beings inside a tomb of their own making, and then walked away. Why? Nobody knows, and the honesty of that nobody knows is exactly what makes it so unsettling, because human beings do not do this casually. Burying a monument this size is not a weekend project. It would have taken an immense, coordinated effort, possibly as much labor as building parts of it in the first place. You do not accidentally bury a temple. You do not do it out of laziness. Whatever drove these people to entomb their most sacred structure, it was a decision made with intent, by a society capable of organizing the same massive workforce that raised the pillars in the first place. The theories run in every direction. Some researchers suggest it was ritual, that the enclosures had a lifespan. When a structure had served its sacred purpose, it was respectfully decommissioned, retired, to rest under the earth the way you might bury a body. There's a strange logic to that. Skull evidence we'll get to suggests these people had a deep and specific relationship with death and burial, and entombing a temple may have been an extension of that. Other researchers have argued the burial was partly practical, a way of stabilizing or preserving the structures. And some have wondered whether the burials mark moments of crisis, that something happened, something that made an entire community decide its holiest place needed to be hidden, covered, sealed shut, and removed from the sky. Here's the consequence that matters, regardless of the reason. That deliberate burial is the only reason any of this survived. Packed fill protected the carvings from 11,000 years of weather, erosion, and vandalism. Reliefs that came out of the ground are crisp. The pillars are intact. The site is, by the standards of anything that old, astonishingly preserved. And it's preserved precisely because someone hid it. The act that erased Gobekli Tepe from history is the same act that saved it for us to find. Which means whoever buried this place inadvertently sent a message forward across 11,000 years, sealed and waiting, addressed to whoever finally dug it back up. And when the excavators did dig it back up, first thing they had to reckon with wasn't the carvings or the burial. It was a problem of pure physics, because the things buried inside those walls should not have been possible to build at all. Let's talk about the pillars themselves, because the numbers are where the story stops being merely surprising and starts being genuinely hard to explain. The enclosures at Gobekli Tepe are built around massive T-shaped pillars of limestone. The ones excavated so far stand up to around 5.5 meters tall, roughly 18 feet, and the largest weigh somewhere in the range of 10 tons, with estimates for some of the quarried examples running up towards 16. Each enclosure is a ring of these pillars set into the bedrock, 2 even larger pillars standing in the center, facing each other. There are multiple enclosures. Each one contains many pillars. Every pillar had to be cut, shaped, decorated, transported, and raised. Now remember the toolkit available to the people who did this. No metal, not bronze, not iron, not even copper, none of which had been invented. No wheel, no draft animals. Nothing had been domesticated yet, so there were no oxen to haul loads. No pulleys, no cranes, no written engineering. The hardest material they had to work with was other stone. They quarried these multi-ton monoliths out of the surrounding limestone bedrock using stone tools. And you can still see the evidence, because there's an unfinished pillar lying in a nearby quarry to this day, around 7 meters long, abandoned mid-extraction, still attached to the bedrock it was being carved out of. It would have weighed an estimated 50 tons. Think about the chain of problems that has to be solved to make even one finished pillar. First, you have to select and shape a slab inside a solid rock shelf, cutting it free from 3 sides, and the bottom using stone hammers and picks without cracking it. Then you have to move it, a 10-ton block, across hundreds of meters of uneven terrain, with no wheel and no animals, using nothing but human muscle, rope made from plant fiber, and presumably wooden levers and sledges. Then you have to stand it upright and seat it precisely into a socket cut into the bedrock, without it toppling and shattering, and without crushing anyone. And then you have to do it again and again, dozens of times, for a single enclosure. This requires more than strength. It requires applied physics, an intuitive but real understanding of leverage, of center of mass, of load distribution, how to coordinate the timed effort of dozens or hundreds of people pulling and bracing in unison. It requires planning and a command structure. And it requires it from a culture that, by the textbook definition, hadn't yet taken the supposed first steps towards civilization. We are talking about people who left behind no cities and no writing, but who solved engineering problems that would challenge a modern crew, working without machines. And they didn't just move these stones, they carved them. In deep, confident, 3-dimensional relief. Foxes mid-leap, boars with bristled backs, snakes pouring down the surfaces in tangles, scorpions, spiders, cranes, vultures, aurochs. Carving wasn't crude scratching. It was sculpture, executed in hard limestone with stone tools by artists who clearly knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times before, which raises its own quiet question. Tradition this skilled doesn't appear from nothing. Where did these people learn to do this? What came before Gobekli Tepe that we haven't found yet? But the carvings lead to something even stranger than the engineering. Because the more closely researchers looked at the great central pillars, the more they realized they weren't looking at architecture at all. Pillars weren't holding up a roof. They weren't decoration. They were portraits, and they were looking back. For years, the assumption was the obvious one. T-shaped pillars are columns, and columns hold things up. Gobekli Tepe's pillars don't support anything. And once researchers started reading the carvings on the great central monoliths as a whole, rather than as scattered decoration, a different and far more haunting interpretation took over. The pillars are people, but one of the large central pillars straight on, and the shape resolves. The wide horizontal top of the T is a head, seen in profile abstraction, faceless but unmistakably a head sitting atop a tall, flat body. And along the vertical shaft, carved in low relief, are arms. They run down the sides, bend at the elbow, and they wrap around to the front, where 2 hands meet, long carved fingers reaching toward each other just above where a belt is depicted. Below the belt, on at least one of the great central figures, hangs a carved garment, interpreted as a loincloth made of an animal pelt. These are not columns wearing decoration. They are stylized human, or more than human, figures, standing upright, hands folded over their bellies, dressed and belted, gazing out across the enclosure. This changes the entire feeling of the place. An enclosure at Gobekli Tepe is not a room full of pillars. It is a gathering of giant stone beings arranged in a ring, 2 towering central figures standing face to face in the middle, as if presiding over the rest. Whoever entered that space was not walking into a building. They were walking into an assembly, surrounded by colossal, faceless, watching figures, each one taller than a man, each one carved with arms and hands and clothing, standing in eternal silent congregation. Who were they meant to be? The most common interpretation is that these are not ordinary people but something elevated, ancestors, spirits, gods, or the powerful dead. Their facelessness may be the entire point. These aren't portraits of specific living individuals but representations of beings beyond the human, deliberately stripped of identifying features to mark them as something other. The animals carved across their bodies, the dangerous ones especially, the scorpions and snakes and vultures and predators, may function almost like attributes or guardians, the way later gods would be associated with particular sacred beasts. And notice what this does to the timeline of human imagination. 11,500 years ago, before farming, before writing, people were not just surviving day to day in a fog of immediate need. They were carving monumental representations of beings they could not see. They had a mythology rich and specific enough to demand stone figures 18 feet tall, dressed and posed and ringed in symbolic animals. They had gods, or ancestors, or something that functioned like them, and they were willing to spend years of collective labor and unimaginable effort to make those beings physically present, standing in the landscape, watching. So we have a temple older than agriculture, deliberately buried, built with impossible effort and populated by giant carved beings. The people who made it clearly had a complex relationship with the unseen. The next discovery showed exactly how far that relationship extended, because it reached past gods and ancestors, all the way to the bodies of the dead themselves. In 2017, a team of researchers published a study that added a genuinely disturbing dimension to everything we knew about Gobekli Tepe. They had been examining fragments of human skull bone recovered from the site, and on those fragments they found something that did not happen by accident. The skull pieces bore deliberate modifications. Carved into the bone, running along the top of the skull, were intentional grooves, straight, purposeful incisions made with stone tools after death. And on at least one fragment, there was a drilled hole, a perforation bored cleanly through the bone. When the researchers analyzed the placement and the angles, they arrived at an interpretation that is hard to shake once you've heard it. These skulls had been carved and drilled so that they could be hung, suspended. The grooves would have helped hold a cord in place running along the skull. The drilled hole would have anchored it. These were human heads, modified after death to be displayed. This is the evidence behind what archaeologists call the skull cult of Gobekli Tepe, and it doesn't sit in isolation. The carvings across the site are saturated with imagery of decapitation and the dead. There is a relief of a vulture with what appears to be a human head presented near it. There are depictions interpreted as headless human figures. There are sculpted heads found broken from larger statues. Throughout the iconography of this place runs a clear and repeated obsession with the human head as something separable, something significant, something to be removed, carved, handled, and shown. What does it mean? The leading interpretation connects it to ancestor veneration and the ritual treatment of the dead, a practice in which the skulls of certain individuals, perhaps revered ancestors or perhaps the defeated, were singled out, modified, and put on display, possibly hung within the enclosures among the great stone beings. Imagine standing inside that ring 11,000 years ago, surrounded by towering faceless figures carved with predators, and among them the actual carved skulls of the dead, suspended and watching alongside the stone ancestors. The line between the living, the dead, and the divine wasn't blurred at Gobekli Tepe. It may not have existed at all, and the vultures matter here in a way that connects to how these people seem to have understood death itself. Across the ancient Near East, there's evidence of sky burial, the practice of exposing the dead so that vultures would strip the body, carrying the flesh upward into the sky. The vulture wasn't a symbol of horror to these people. It may have been a sacred intermediary, creature that escorted the dead from the earthly body into whatever came next, which is exactly why the most famous single carving at Gobekli Tepe, a pillar dominated by a great vulture, has become the center of the most explosive and most contested claim about the entire site. Because some researchers believe that particular stone isn't just religious imagery. They believe it's a record, a memorial, a message carved in stone about the day the sky itself turned against the world. Among all the carved pillars excavated so far, one has taken on a life of its own. Archaeologists call it Pillar 43. Everyone else calls it the vulture stone. It is one of the most densely carved surfaces at the entire site, and it is strange even by Gobekli Tepe standards. Dominating the scene is a large vulture, its wing bent in a way that almost looks like an arm. Above or beside that wing sits a carved circle, a disc, a ball, a sphere. Around it are other creatures, a scorpion crawling near the base, snake, various birds, and tucked into the lower portion of the scene is a small headless human figure. It is a busy, deliberate, crowded composition, and for years it was read the way the rest of the site is read, as religious and funerary symbolism, vultures and death, and the journey of the soul. Then, in 2017, two researchers proposed something that set off a firestorm. Studying the arrangement of the animals on Pillar 43, they argued that the figures weren't just symbolic creatures, they were astronomical symbols, constellations. And by treating the carvings as a star map and running the positions backward through software that models the slow shifting of the night sky over thousands of years, they claimed the stone was pointing to a specific date, roughly 10,950 BC. That date is not random. Around that time, the Earth is thought to have entered a sudden, brutal cold snap known as the Younger Dryas, a sharp return to near Ice Age, conditions that struck within a human lifetime and lasted over 1,000 years. And one controversial scientific hypothesis proposes that this cold snap was triggered by a cosmic catastrophe, the impact or airburst of fragments of a disintegrating comet, raining fire across the northern hemisphere. Researchers studying Pillar 43 argued that the vulture stone is a memorial to exactly that event, that the headless man represents mass human death, that the circle above the vulture's wing is the comet or the sun, that the people of Gobekli Tepe carved this stone to commemorate the day the sky fell and the world froze. Catastrophe burned into cultural memory and preserved for thousands of years in limestone. If that interpretation is correct, it's staggering. It would mean Gobekli Tepe isn't only the oldest temple, it's the oldest known monument to a specific dated event. Stone newspaper headline about a planetary disaster carved by survivors or their descendants. But, and this is essential, and the genre of this story demands honesty here, this interpretation is contested. It is not the accepted mainstream view. The archaeologists most closely connected to Gobekli Tepe have pushed back hard. They've argued that you can't reliably read these carvings as a precise star map. The same animals appear all over the site in contexts that have nothing to do with astronomy. There's no solid evidence the people who carved Pillar 43 were encoding constellations at all. That the comet impact hypothesis behind the Younger Dryas is itself fiercely disputed among scientists. The official position is that the vulture stone is powerful religious and funerary imagery, and that the apocalyptic star map reading, however compelling, is speculation built on top of speculation. So which is it? Coincidence of symbols that pattern-hungry modern minds turned into a comet, or a genuine 11,000-year-old memorial to the day the heavens caught fire? The carving sits in the ground exactly as it was left, refusing to settle the argument. And it's not the only claim that the people of Gobekli Tepe were watching the sky with far more attention than anyone wants to credit them for. The astronomical argument didn't end with the vulture stone. It escalated. More recently, the same line of research pushed further, examining repeated symbols carved across several pillars at the site. In particular, sequences of V-shaped marks and other repeated geometric signs that show up again and again on the great stones. The proposal that came out of this work was even bolder than the comet memorial. It suggested that some of these markings weren't decorative at all, functional, that they form a kind of record-keeping system tied to the passage of time, that the V-shapes might count days. Arrangements of symbols might track the cycle of the year, the months, the seasons, the solar calendar, and even register the slow, almost imperceptible wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the stars across thousands of years. In other words, claim is that Gobekli Tepe may contain one of the oldest attempts at a calendar in human history. Not just art, not just gods, a system. People marking time, tracking the sun and the seasons and the stars, doing the foundational work of astronomy. 11,500 years ago, before farming, before writing, before any of the things we assume you need before you can start doing science. And there's a logic to why hunter-gatherers, transitioning toward a settled life, would care intensely about the calendar. If you're beginning to depend on the timing of seasons, when game migrates, when wild grains ripen, when the cold returns, then knowing where you are in the year is a matter of survival. People who had just lived through something like the Younger Dryas, a sudden plunge into a frozen world, might have very good reason to start watching the sky with obsessive precision, trying to read it, trying to never be caught off guard by the heavens again. But once again, and the pattern here is important, this is a contested claim, not settled fact. The mainstream archaeological community treats the calendar interpretation with deep caution. Critics point out that it's extraordinarily difficult to prove that a repeated symbol means a unit of time, rather than simply being a recurring, decorative or religious motif, and that the statistical methods used to find these calendars can find patterns in carvings that were never intended as data. The researchers most associated with the site have not endorsed the calendar reading. It remains a fringe-leaning hypothesis, fascinating, widely circulated, and far from confirmed. so we're left with two versions of the same people. In the cautious version, people of Gobekli Tepe were brilliant hunter-gatherers with a rich religion who built something extraordinary. In the bolder version, they were also astronomers, sky watchers tracking comets and seasons and the wheel of the year encoding catastrophe and time into stone. The evidence doesn't yet let us choose with certainty. But here's what makes the uncertainty bearable, even thrilling, instead of frustrating. We have barely looked. Everything you've heard so far, the impossible date, the deliberate burial, the 16-ton pillars, standing stone beings, the carved and drilled skulls, the vulture stone, the calendar, every bit of it comes from a small fraction of the site. Because here is the fact that the excavators themselves describe as almost overwhelming, the fact that puts everything else in its true and staggering scale. After roughly 30 years of excavation, vast majority of Gobekli Tepe is still in the ground. Ground-penetrating surveys of the hill have mapped what lies beneath the unexcavated surface, and the readings show many more enclosures. At least a dozen and likely around 20 large stone structures, still completely buried, still sealed under the earth, never touched, never seen. The handful of magnificent enclosures that produced everything in this story represent something on the order of just 5 to 10% of what the instruments say is down there. Klaus Schmidt himself estimated that fully excavating the site would take 50 years or more. He died in 2014. He saw a fraction of what he found, and he knew it. More than 90% of Gobekli Tepe, 90% of the oldest temple on Earth, is still waiting, exactly as its builders left it, sealed in the dark. And then the story got bigger than one hill. Because as archaeologists kept surveying the region around Gobekli Tepe, they realized it was not alone. Scattered across the surrounding landscape of southeastern Turkey are other sites, sister sites, with the same T-shaped pillars, the same monumental ambition, the same impossible age. The most famous of them, Karahan Tepe, sometimes called Gobekli Tepe's twin, has been yielding its own astonishing carvings and structures, including chambers cut into bedrock and rows of pillars unlike anything found before. And these two are only the headline names. Researchers working under a regional project have identified roughly a dozen related sites across the same stretch of hills, an entire constellation of monumental stone centers built by the same culture in the same era, almost none of them yet excavated. Sit with what that means. Gobekli Tepe is not a one-off freak of history, a single inexplicable monument standing alone in the dirt. It is one node in a whole network. An entire civilization of monument builders existed in this region 11,500 years ago, or farming, leaving behind a landscape studded with temples, and we have dug into only a sliver of one of them. There is, quite literally, a lost world buried under those hills. Chambers, pillars, carvings, skulls, gods, and answers. Thousands of years of human belief and effort memory, lying sealed beneath the surface, where the people who made them packed them away, and where they have remained ever since. So let's go back to the promise in the title. What did they actually find when they opened the walls of Gobekli Tepe? And how does it change everything? It changes everything because of the order. For our entire lives, we were taught that civilization had a recipe, and the recipe had a fixed sequence. First agriculture, then settlement, then surplus, then society, and only at the very end, as a final flourish, religion and monuments. Gobekli Tepe takes that sequence and breaks it in half. Here is monumental sacred architecture, the supposed last step, built first, by people who hadn't taken any of the earlier steps yet. The temple came before the farm, the god came before the granary, cathedral came before the city. And the man who dug it out of the ground concluded that it wasn't a contradiction, but a revelation. The drive to build something sacred, to gather around the divine, may be the original spark. The thing that pulled our ancestors out of their wandering and set the entire machinery of civilization into motion. History did not begin where we were taught it began. It did not start in a wheat field. It started, as far as we can now tell, on a hill in Turkey around a ring of giant carved beings, raised by people who had nothing the textbooks said they needed and built it anyway, and then buried it perfectly, like a message addressed to us. Skulls are real. The 16-ton pillars are real. The deliberate burial is real. The standing stone beings with their folded hands are real. Carvings of vultures and scorpions and headless men are real. The impossible date is real, and the 90% still in the ground is real. Somewhere under that hill, sealed in the dark, exactly the way its builders left it. 11,500 years ago, the rest of the story is still waiting. The oldest temple on Earth has barely been opened, and everything we think we know about where we came from is sitting on top of a question we have only just begun to dig out of the dirt. History didn't begin where they told us. It began here, and we are still standing at the very edge of how much more there is to find.